This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 29 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, July 18th, 1908. I will add commentary to elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago. The July 18th issue starts with an obituary. It brought feelings of genuine sadness to her many friends when word went around the village last week, Thursday and Friday, of the sudden and serious illness of Miss Rebecca E. Luce. No encouraging report came from her sick room, and she passed away at noon Saturday. Although in rather frail health, she had been able to be about as usual, and on Thursday went to the post office as was her habit, following her neighborly custom of carrying the mail to those families living near her. After getting home, she complained of feeling ill and of severe pain in the back of her head. This grew worse until she lapsed into unconsciousness, from which she never rallied. All that love and skill could suggest was done, but she passed away peacefully Saturday. She was the eldest daughter of the late Reverend Leonard and Mrs. Rebecca E. Gould Luce, and had spent the whole of her life here and had always been identified with the best interests of the community and stood for all that was upright and noble in human character. Gentle and refined in nature, loyal in her devotion to home and church, she leaves in the memory of her many friends a record of Christian living dear to the hearts of all who knew her. She was a student at Westford Academy and later at LaSalle Seminary in Auburndale. She was a faithful and successful teacher in both public school and Sabbath school for many years, and to the day of her death held the loyal affection of former pupils. She possessed in no small degree the happy gift of writing accurately and entertainingly. At the rededication of the Congregational Church several years ago, it was actually in 1897, she wrote an historical article which, as the daughter of the first pastor and her lifelong association with the church, will be of great value in the records of the church in years to come. She also gave valuable assistance in keeping the records of the town clerk during the years that her father held that office. Her immediate family consisted of her only sister, Miss Miranda G. Luce, who has the sincere sympathy of all who know how close the bond of sisterly affection was between them. Also, James L. Kimball of Boston, an only nephew, who was devotedly attached to his aunt. The funeral was held from the pleasant home where she had spent her long life. The house was on Main Street, just down to the west from where Graniteville comes in. The funeral was held from the pleasant home where she had spent her long life Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock and was largely attended by neighbors, kindred, and friends. Reverends Charles P. Marshall and B.H. Bailey were the officiating clergymen. Mr. Marshall, her pastor, paid fitting tribute to her memory. He said in part that at the close of this long and useful life, it could be said with special appropriateness, quote, "Well done, good and faithful servant, enter the joy of the Lord," end quote, and, quote, "Hers was a life of wonderful devotion. Some lives are great in their achievement of great things. Hers was a life that gave itself with the greatest self-effacement to the duties of life," end quote. He spoke of the beautiful devotion of father and mother, the devotion to sisters and nephew and niece with a spirit that knew no self. Quote, "She gave self to others. If devotion is an old-fashioned trait at the stress of our modern life, it may all the more conspicuous the cases of self-giving. Nor was it only in the home circle that this life was given, but in the larger interests of the church and community. Miss Luce did one thing for us especially of our church. She connected us with the earlier time, being, as she loved to call herself, the first child of the parish. You might wonder why she called herself the first child of the parish when Westford was founded in 1729, long before she was born. The Union Congregational Church split from the First Parish Unitarian Church and was formally organized in 1828. Reverend Leonard Luce, her father, an 1824 graduate of Brown and just graduated from Andover Theological Seminary, preached his first sermon here on October 1st, 1828. He was invited to serve as the church's first pastor, was ordained April 8th, 1829, and was married October 18th, 1829. The new church building, now the Performing Center for the Arts on Lincoln Street, was built and dedicated on October 8th, 1829. The Luce's first child, Rebecca Elizabeth, was born November 8, 1830, certainly one of the first, if not the first, child of this new parish. And to complete her obituary, how valuable this connection with the past is, we in some measure realize, and in some measure we have valued, but in the future, when it is really gone, we shall find how much valuable it really is. Mr. Marshall said that character could not be summed up in one word. It was too complex for that. A true character has many virtues, yet were he asked to write one, he would say devotion, and that he would also like to add the words character and courtesy. Interment was in the family lot at Fairview. The bearers were Captain Sherman H. Fletcher, Charles, who was a neighbor of hers, Charles O. Prescott, Harrison B. Hall, and Henry H. Burbeck, all neighbors of long standing. The flowers, such as Miss Luce so loved in life, were profuse and of great beauty. The next section is the Westford Center section. Miss Eva Young of London, England, is a guest of Mrs. Helen K. Frost. The Frosts met Miss Young in musical circles while living abroad. This is her first visit to America, and she expresses much pleasure with her impressions, and particularly of our pleasant hill town. Mr. and Mrs. Henry M. Wright and son Livingston, age 12, of Quincy, are making their customary July sojourn at Nahum H. Wright's, Henry Wright's father's home, his mother having died in 1896. Marden and Marjorie Seavey have been entertained the past week in Cambridge by their grandmother, Mrs. M.E. Mitchell. Mrs. Seavey and Master Gordon Seavey spent last week with friends at Clifton on the North Shore. These three Seavey children, Marden, Marjorie, and Gordon, were children of Homer and Addie Mitchell Seavey, who lived across the street from the town hall. There was also a fourth child, a son named Morton. Mrs. W. M. Wright has been seriously ill the past week with an attack of her old enemy, heart trouble, but at this writing is much more comfortable. Miss J. Florence Wilson is ill at her home on the Boston Road under the care of Dr. Godfrey of Littleton. The Julian Camerons are at their home at Cross Island, Essex, for a few weeks at their summer home. It is a pleasure of her many friends to have Miss Florence H. Reed. She's Florence Haywood Reed was born in May 1877 Westford and was the daughter of Joseph Henry and Mary Eleanor Falls Reed. At the Congregational Church Sunday evening, William A. Perkins conducted the meeting from the subject Character and Courtesy in an especially helpful and able way. It was with keenest regret that his hearers realized that this was one of the last of the courteous manifestations of Christian helpfulness that he would render this church, for which he and his family have done so much during their 3 years' sojourn in our midst. They moved the latter part of the month to their new home in Grafton, taking with them all the good wishes of the Westford friends. We'll hear more about his going-away party. Mr. and Mrs. A.I. Bicknell reached the 40th milestone in their journey of married life. Last Saturday, actually it was on July 13th, not Saturday, and received many congratulations from friends. Mrs. Bicknell was born Sarah F. Whitney, and A.I. Bicknell was a veteran of the Civil War and a longtime Westford resident. Lived in the house that used to be at 2 Main Street. An alleviating circumstance of the drought, which by the time this is printed we hope may be a thing of the past, is that those who had the new water supply installed last fall have had plenty of good water to use and are not frightened with the thought of well or cistern going dry. Many families have wet down lawn and flower beds with hose to offset, in a measure, the lack of rain. At the last analysis by the state chemist, the water showed excellent results, ranking 3rd of any in the state. Miss Sarah D. Hamlin, who recently made a visit to her native town, writes of her safe arrival back in San Francisco, arriving a day earlier than she expected. Miss Emily F. Fletcher enjoyed a pleasant trip of several days to Stowe, Vermont last week, going up Mount Mansfield and staying overnight at the summer house. Emily was an experienced naturalist. Among other things, she discovered a number of plants from Australia and other places that had been washed out of imported wool at the Abbott Worsted Company and had sprouted up along Stony Brook. Miss Lila C. Fisher sends to the home people delightful accounts of her western trip. During her stay in Denver, she met her old friend and neighbor, Roy B. Wheeler, one of our Westford boys who makes his home in Denver. He's the brother of Leonard Wheeler, who's mentioned quite frequently. Reverend O.B. Wells of Franklin, Vermont, has been a recent guest of his brother, Dr. Orion V. Wells. Marion Gertrude Sherman, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Daniel W. Sherman, died at her home Wednesday, July 15th, after a lingering illness, aged 35 years and 3 months. She is survived by her parents, a sister, Mrs. William Pollock, and a brother, David Sherman, also 2 nephews and a niece. She was a young woman of many estimable qualities, and the family have the sympathy of many friends in their bereavement. The funeral was held from her late home Thursday at 2 o'clock, Reverend Charles P. Marshall officiating. Interment in Fairview. The next section is the About Town section. The county surveyors have been surveying on the Lowell Road in search of the county bounds established at the time the road was built 45 years ago. For a bill of particulars as to the where at of these bounds, inquire of the Lowell and Fitchburg Electric Railway. The last seen of some of these bounds, they were on a drag owned by said company. This, of course, was during the building of the road, when all things movable had no abiding place. An accident occurred on the electric road last week, Thursday afternoon, delaying travel until the next morning. The car, which left North Chelmsford for Ayer, when arriving at the junction of the line for Westford, attempted to go to Ayer and Westford at the same time, the forward wheels starting for Ayer and the rear wheels for Westford. As this could not be done, a compromise was effected, and the car landed against the waiting station. The car was full of passengers, and like all compromises, nobody was satisfied. Good authority says that the strong Groton ball team has not been defeated this season. That is certainly seasoned with remarkableness. With this point of view before them, the Westford team went to Groton last Saturday afternoon and took the remarkableness out of the Groton team by a score of 17-3. This Saturday afternoon, the Westford team will play the TR&T team of North Billerica at Stony Brook Park near Westford Station. Joseph Danforth of Tingsboro has been appointed principal of Westford Academy. He is a graduate of Tufts College, has taught in Vermont, and is plural. I think he means by that he is married. Albert A. Hildreth, who lives on Concord Road, who has been mistrusting for some time that the drought was interfering with the rights of his crops, has had it arrested. He certainly has not arrested it all, but of course one gasoline engine and house pipe can't reach everybody's disturbance. I think what he's trying to say is that Albert is using a well to pump water to water his crops. There was a precipitation of moisture last Sunday afternoon, like unto a heavy dew. Forge Village got about all the rainfall. This, with the licensed liquor institution to wet people down, ought to keep them in a state of moisture until others are served. The crops in the Stony Brook Valley are singing for more of this dew. They would sing louder, but are hoarse for want of something to drink. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Cameron and children, Mrs. J.L. Fisk and Miss M.J. Taylor, returned Monday on the Cymric from a motor trip in England, Scotland, and Wales. Mr. Cameron traveled over 3,000 miles, and although he went through some difficult passes in the mountains, he had no trouble with his car. Mr. and Mrs. A.J. Abbott, Miss Carnzu Abbott, and John Abbott return the first of next week from the motor trip in Europe. I believe that Donald Cameron took his own car to Europe to drive around in. At a meeting of the Spalding Light Cavalry Association at Town Hall Wednesday evening, it was voted to hold a reunion at Nabnasset Pond August 13th. The Nashville Military Band has been engaged to lead in sounding the notes, recalling old-time memories. Various other attractions will make you wish you were there also. Samuel L. Taylor is busy today eating the first sweet corn of the season. Of course, the dry weather hindered its approach by several weeks. The next section is the Graniteville section. After many weeks of dry weather, this village was visited by a thunderstorm and heavy rain last Sunday afternoon that lasted about half an hour. During the storm, lightning struck a large tree in front of David Shattuck's house on 3rd Street, breaking it completely off about 15 feet from the top. Several of the families in that vicinity were very much alarmed for a time, for it was feared that some house was struck nearby. A party of young men who had been bathing in Burgess Pond got caught in the rain near the electric track and were forced to take shelter in a shed. It was fortunate that they did so, for had they continued on their journey, they would have been right in the path of the bolt that struck the tree. Mr. and Mrs. Lester McClenna of Cross Street are rejoicing in the arrival of a baby girl, born last Saturday. That was Regina H. McClenna. Miss Margaret O'Hara, who is now a district nurse in Concord, New Hampshire, has been a recent visitor in this village. James B. Healy is on an extended vacation visiting relatives in Wellsville, New York. Miss Alice Fitzpatrick, who has been visiting with Mr. and Mrs. J.A. Healy in this village for the past few days, has returned to her home in Wellsville, New York. Commencing this week, the mills of the Abbott Worsted Company, both here and in Forge Village, will run on a 50-hour basis. These mills for the past few months have been running on a 40-hour schedule, and the new order of things has proved very pleasing to the village people as well as to the employees of the mills. In spite of the dry weather that has proved very disastrous to the berry crop in this vicinity, it appears that there will be an abundance of swamp blueberries, and many people in this village have taken advantage of the opportunity and returned with full pails of fine berries after visiting the swamps in the outlying districts. The St. John's Juniors visited here last Saturday afternoon and met with defeat at the hands of the Brimstones by a score of 10-8. The game was replete with many fast fielding stunts, and there was heavy batting on both sides. The batteries were McCarthy and Ledwith for the Brimstones, Potter, Scanlon, and McTeague for the St. John's. The next section is the Forge Village section. Tuesday afternoon, sparks from the engine, that is from a steam locomotive engine on the Stony Brook Railroad, set the grass on fire on the W.E. Parsons place and on the Whigham place, but by the prompt attention of section men and neighbors it was subdued, and the rain finished the work. The fire department was called and responded to a man, but fortunately they did not have to use the hose. Wilson and Harvey Lyons of Randolph with a party of friends are at the Woodlands. Mr. and Mrs. Schofield of Lawrence at Mr. Parrott's cottage, Mr. and Mrs. William Murphy of Lowell at Crow's Nest, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Nichols and two daughters, Helen and Mildred, at their cottage, Mr. Tizer and family at his cottage. There are about 40 cottages on the shore of Forge Pond, and nearly all are filled for the summer. Mr. and Mrs. Watson and daughters, Mr. and Mrs. Needham and daughters, and Clara Bailey visited Mr. and Mrs. Miles Collins over Sunday. Mrs. Ouellette and son have gone to St. Albans, Vermont to visit her husband's people. Her father is living and, although over 90 years of age, is enjoying comfortable health. On her return, she will spend the rest of her vacation at their cottage here. Mr. and Mrs. Timothy Sullivan and daughter of Marlborough spent Sunday at his brother's, James Sullivan. The Neptune Club took advantage of the warm weather Sunday and spent the day in the water, that is Forge Pond. Stella Carkin, Bertha Collins, Nellie Burns, Nellie Olden, and Mrs. Polly DeRone are the latest members to be admitted. Miss Collins has kindly offered to build a diving board. Miles Collins, that is, Miles is the man's first name, has kindly offered to build a diving board, which will be placed in position as soon as possible. Emerson DeRone, who was so severely hurt in the mill last week, is improving rapidly. The next section is called Surprise. Miss Nellie Henderson of Malden is at her camp, the Lincoln, with a jolly party for a week. Miss Henderson arrived on Saturday, and Mr. and Mrs. Field of Malden and Mrs. H.W. Baldwin of Everett. On Monday, Miss Henderson went to the village for other guests, and on returning was greatly surprised to hear the strains of the Star-Spangled Banner from her graphophone and to see a beautiful flag, 6 by 9 feet, flung to the breeze. The flag was presented by Mademoiselles Field, Baldwin, Wesson, Flint, and James of Chelsea, Dinan, Dutton, and Conan of Everett, and Miss Winfield Cook of Revere. The ladies have formed a club to be known as the Campers, with Miss Henderson president, Mrs. Baldwin secretary and treasurer, Mrs. Corman patriotic instructor. Dottie, the pet dog of Mrs. Field, is the mascot of the club. On Wednesday, they entertained Mrs. Parsons, Katie Hanley, and Stella Carkin of Forge Village. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending July 18th, 1908. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions from the Wardsman at the Westford Historical Society's website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.